Hello, I've already been semi-introduced here, but I'm a PhD student at the University of York. I'm coming to the end of my PhD now. I've been doing it now for just over 3 years. And I want to talk to you about one of the things I've been looking at as part of that, and that is the kind of relationship between geography, politics, and how that informs the kind of underlying technical infrastructure that all of you work on. So as part of this, like a bit of a quick recap of what's going on recently. I'm sure all of you have been following the news, and most of this should be fairly familiar, probably. So on the left-hand side here, you can see there's a range of different summits that have been happening recently. On the right-hand side, we've got some of the headlines that have been coming out in the last kind of year or so. Some of this about the kind of amazing ability of AI to suddenly fix all of the UK's economic growth problems. Some of it about algorithms when it comes to kind of X and the kind of control that Elon Musk has exerted upon that. The Coca-Cola one, I don't know if anyone's seen the Coca-Cola Christmas advert. Supposedly all Gen AI. It looks a bit weird, sort of uncanny in many ways, but one of the examples of this AI use being something that a larger company might be investing in instead of traditional production companies, and then some of the kind of closer to home Online Safety Act and verification rules and that kind of thing. So what does this actually have a meaning for when it comes to the topology generally and how we connect in the internet? And that's the kind of question I want to focus on. And then when it comes to how we can collect that information, at the moment, a lot of people collect a lot of internet data and they try and form maps when we do this, but there are a lot of problems with this, and fundamentally it's a problem of if you get like bad data going in, you get terrible data coming out, and some of those problems I've put on the left-hand side here. So when it comes to collecting BGP data, you have very narrow collector placement. A lot of it's centered around the kind of US and Europe, and I'll show you that in kind of an extreme example in a moment. And then how you process that data. So like some people will run a trace route and just assume that like each of these IP addresses assigned to someone, and therefore those IP addresses map perfectly to the organization that owns them. But of course, you'll know that's not the case. All of you appearing supposedly on the LINX LAN, you'll know that you have a LINX IP address that will appear in that trace route. And so people making this kind of judgment would be incorrectly assuming that two networks are connected. So I want to tell you a little bit more about how I get around that problem. And then one of the kind of extreme examples coming out of this, I don't know if anyone read the news in the last couple of weeks, that there was a report that it was SimilarWeb did, and they found that there was a 50% reduction in the number of UK users accessing porn websites. And I'm sure people here will look at that figure and think that's a little bit suspicious. I guess it will depend on how you want to interpret the data and how accurate the data is, and therefore what judgments you can get coming out of that. So when it comes to collecting BGP data, the kind of two big open source projects that we can see the data for free from are going to be RootViews and RIPE-RIS. On this map, I've plotted both of those collections. You'll see that RootViews is mostly centered around the US. It makes sense. It's something that's come out of the University of Oregon. And then in Europe, of course, RIPE NCC and RIPE community are all kind of a European-centric community, extending down to some of kind of the region coming down eastwards from that, or southeastwards. But all of the collectors are placed largely within the service regions of the RIPE NCC, and also when it comes to RootViews within the US. And you'll notice that kind of Africa and Asia, two of the most populous parts of the world, are not really captured within that at all. So whether like 4.978 billion people in Asia, 62% of the world's population aren't covered by very many of these probes at all, or these collectors. One of the ways we can mitigate that slightly is to use the kind of packet clearinghouse data. But again, you'll see that there's a large disparity in where these collectors are placed. So ultimately, whenever it comes to kind of researchers looking at this data, there's going to be some element of bias. I found some ways a little bit to mitigate some of the aspects of that. So, you know, the traditional method of working out who's connected to who is to look at that AS path, look at two ASNs in the path and be like, oh, okay, if they're next to each other, we can assume they're connected. Some people go a bit further and say that we can infer some information about the relationship of those networks. So if you're kind of left or right of a tier one, then we can say that you're kind of downstream of those networks. But the accuracy of that kind of varies a little bit as well. One of the interesting ways we can mitigate that slightly is if we have access to the root servers in different IXPs, we can also collect BGP community values if they've been documented. And although it's not consistent across the world, so we have to be quite careful about how we do it, it can mean that we can infer quite a lot of connectivity. So when it comes to AS paths, on large tier ones, we're missing 10 to 20% of the paths that we don't see from the kind of data we look at. But when it comes to tier two networks downwards, sometimes it's up to 85% is just not captured within the AS path. So we miss a lot of that connectivity. With communities, we mitigate quite a lot of that, and we can find maybe another 50% for some of those smaller networks, which I'd say is quite impressive. And when it comes to kind of an academic perspective, this is kind of monumental in the number of paths we get. And then the last part of this is trace routes. So if we look at a trace route, we can look at where you are on there, or whether we see an IXLAN IP address within that, we can map it to the IX and therefore kind of work out who's possibly connected. If we see 2 hops within the LAN, we can see there's some sort of peering going on. Of course, this is all where we can see relationships between networks and connectivity, not necessarily where traffic is actually going. So some of that we need to kind of be careful about how we make generalizations, which I'll try and do my best as we go forwards. Overall, though, if we combine those 3 approaches, we can see quite a lot more connectivity. So compared to other previous academic studies, and I think it's true for sort of some of the commercial tools that I've tried to check and verify my results against, we're seeing sort of 30% more connectivity than other projects with a relatively good range of accuracy. So I validated it against GISC, which is the UK's education research network. And although I got a couple of inferences wrong, there's quite a lot of peers, I think it's estimated close to like 800 peers or so that I saw. And so the kind of error is quite small relative to the number of accurate inferences it's making. And then going against 2 large networks, I did Aurelian and AS6939, which is Hurricane Electric. And so the accuracy within that, based on what we could see from the looking glass, was quite high, although most of the source of error seems to be coming from sibling networks, where 2 networks are operated by the same entity, and it seems quite difficult from a data collection perspective to be able to tell them apart. So I'm trying to investigate that in a little bit more detail at the moment, but that's the main source of error. Very little of it's kind of incorrectly working out the networks connected. One of the interesting things, if you see the kind of the visibility of who's visible within the BGP collected data versus who's been allocated ASNs, is this kind of disparity between the allocations and the kind of utilization of the allocations. So when we look at the countries with the most allocated ASNs, like the United States, they've got close to 32,000 ASNs allocated, and they're actually only using less than 60% of the ones they've been given. And what's interesting is that the countries that are kind of utilizing more of that space. So I've given you kind of a top highlight of the ones with the most allocated, and then the ones that have the most advertised. And you'll see the kind of utilization of the space they're given in the kind of gray on the right-hand side. If we pop that on a kind of general plot with all of those countries, and I've highlighted the UK as the kind of you are here in the kind of left-hand side of that. Other than the fact that some of the countries that were like earlier established in the internet having a greater level of allocation, but yet poor utilization, what's really interesting to see is that some of the regimes on the right-hand side, when it comes to like really high usage of their allocation, is quite interesting. So when it comes to countries like Iran, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea coming on the top right, where they've used almost 100% of their allocation, and then Russia coming in there as well, the Russian Federation, Afghanistan, intriguingly, very little that we can see from the internet. It makes some sense because of the kind of political scene there, but I think it's interesting to note that kind of the utilization and allocation are 2 very different factors. But if I take us back to the bit where we've collected all the internet data and return to how we can work out that connectivity between different countries, I'm going to put all of that on one map, and towards the center of this, we're going to have a cluster of the countries that are the most deeply interconnected, or the networks that are most deeply interconnected, and it's going to be a force-directed plot, so the ones on the outside of this are the ones that are least connected to each other. Within this, you'll get different clusters. So if a group of networks are deeply interconnected with each other but aren't with anyone else, then they're going to be pushed towards the outside of the graph as well. And that's exactly what's happened, as you see with China, where they have a small number of networks connecting to the rest of the world right to like towards the edge of the main part of the graph. And then right in the bottom of the slide, almost kind of bursting off of it, is the kind of the Chinese domestic connectivity, which is almost entirely separate because it goes through the kind of Great Firewall of China, and it's very visible within the measured data. Some of the other countries that are interesting from this is Belarus at the top. This because the Russian is the kind of dark browner mass, and then Belarus in that really light shade coming out of the top is entirely hanging off of the Russian internet, which, if you know the political scene there, Belarus and Russia are quite close. It makes some sense within that, but it's still quite fascinating that would be so visible within the data. We also see that with Iran, so I'll give you another slide in a moment where we explore that in a little bit more detail, but you can see that the Iranian internet is kind of one stripe at the bottom with almost a single line connecting it to the rest of the world. So in trying to attribute why you might see some of these trends, the first thing we could look at is the kind of geographical aspect. it makes sense that a country that might be more geographically isolated, therefore, wouldn't be as deeply connected with the rest of the world. And we'll see that now if I take this next chart. This is one that looks at the darker shades being the countries with the most neighbors. So Russia's got 14 neighbors, depending on how you count the number of kind of countries they border. The UK has Ireland, so that'd be one, and so it's a much lighter shade. If we look at that, you can see that the kind of the right-hand side of the graph tends to have more countries bordering it, and therefore it's darker, and the left lighter. If we look at that instead by the number of countries that a country's networks peer with, it's quite a different plot. So on the left-hand side here, you see the United States does peering with a lot of the rest of the world. It makes sense. A lot of hyperscalers have a strong US presence and therefore would do quite a lot of this. Some countries almost entirely vanish, and you'll notice that Greenland and Iceland at the top have almost just completely disappeared. So if I replot this, I'll take out the United States to try and make the rest of the world slightly more evident. I'll take you back to the kind of number of countries that each country borders here. And I'm going to invert the colors so that countries with the fewest number of international AS peers are now going to be darker, and the ones with the most are going to be lighter. You can now see kind of more extremely that kind of Greenland, which has its own country code, which is why it's featured separately to Denmark. The ones with the fewest international peers are tending to be those kind of island nations. So you have Iceland, Greenland. Down at the bottom, you can also see New Zealand is kind of really quite dark on the bottom side. Papua New Guinea, just above Australia, also another dark shaded country. Madagascar, also like that. But one of the other ones that's quite interesting here is some of the countries that are kind of landlocked countries. So when it comes to Belarus, we saw that shooting off the top of Russia. We can also see that on here it's quite dark. There's very few international peers. And we also see the same true for countries like Mongolia, which are countries surrounded by others, and therefore we wouldn't expect this to be the case. So we can see there's some sort of relationship going on with the geography, but that doesn't really explain all of it. So the next part we can look at is what's happening with politics and how that politics aspect is shaping the way that the internet is implemented and the way people peer with each other. And I'm going to give you a relatively extreme example next. We saw Iran previously on that kind of global plot coming off the bottom left-hand side. This is it in more detail, kind of established as its own separate plot. So here is Iran and the countries that Iran is peering with, or the networks and where they're primarily based. And what's interesting here is almost all of the Iranian networks are quite deeply connected on the top left of the graph. There aren't that many of them, but still it's noticeable. And then almost all external traffic is getting routed through one network, the Telecommunication Infrastructure Company. The Telecommunication Infrastructure Company is operated almost exclusively by the Iranian Ministry of Telecommunications, which also explains some of it. And you'll also know probably from various things you might have seen that they have a quite strong internet filtering regime within the country. It's the case, according to the ISP Association, that almost 93% of young people and almost 84% of the general population regularly use a VPN, which I think is an interesting statistic coming out of it. And as the regimes crack down on that, anecdotally, a lot of people are now starting to rent VPSs outside of the country and sort of set them up as kind of personal family VPNs as a way of making this problem too difficult for the ministry to navigate. But what we can see here is quite clearly a very big example of the way that politics is influencing the connectivity of the country. If we look a little bit closer to home, we can think about some of the kind of political drivers here and how material we might be able to see them when it comes to connectivity. This is the UK's internet from January this year. This is just UK-based networks, removing some of the international connectivity around the outside. I'll add that in a moment. But what you can see is generally, UK networks are very deeply peered with each other, which I think is quite nice, and it shows the influence of places like LINX in bringing people together and helping people work together. You, of course, get some networks that are hanging off others, so that would be where maybe one company is paying another one for upstream connectivity, and therefore they're not directly peering with other networks. But generally, you've got this kind of deep mesh. If we flip towards looking at the different types of networks within that, I'm going to add in the first degree of foreign neighbors as well, just to give a little bit of context to it. This is the UK internet in 2022, looking at the January period. And what we can see is on the left-hand side, we have this sort of small cluster of content and CDN networks. All of these are Swiss networks, and I can't quite work out what was happening in 2022 that Swiss content networks were less integrated with the general internet. But nonetheless, still we see quite a lot of interconnectivity within the kind of UK market when it comes to different operators working with each other. We also see this quite prominent shade of network service providers being really dominant within the space as well, interconnected quite clearly with global carriers, which I think is an interesting thing. At the top here, I put international content. I'll look at that in more detail, but it's a very specific type of international content. That's Russian international content, and it has a huge part within this graph because it's separate from the main domestic internet, but still really clearly connected. In 2025, the graph's changed a little bit. So this is looking at July, so very recent data when it comes to kind of studying it. We'll see that the deeply interconnected with carriers is a theme that's continued. It's kind of drawn in the mesh. What's also interesting is that those content networks from Switzerland have become more connected. So clearly that's some sort of focus on the market there, bringing them more together with the general connectivity. Also, Colt has clearly done some sort of expansion within the UK because there are now a whole load of networks, a little stripe coming up the bottom, all hanging off of it and not connected to the rest of the UK network without going through them, which is an interesting theme. But generally, what we could say is content delivery is more local. We can see that that blue is kind of merged further in, which is an interesting change, but I'm hesitant to kind of attribute that specifically to things like the Online Safety Act because it's too early to be able to tell if that was the driver or maybe it's just the growth in CDNs and hyperscalers. Nonetheless, it's an interesting theme that maybe some of you will be able to explain more to me in a little bit. But when we switch to looking at this as a kind of global political situation, and we look at the countries we're connecting to rather than the types of network, the themes are slightly clearer. So more colors are being drawn out here more vividly. So this is back to 2022. You can see those content CDNs on the left-hand side from Switzerland, quite clearly our own section. France just below it, sort of French networks. On the right-hand side, there's still quite a strong Brazilian presence. It's true within the global internet. It's true within the UK internet. I haven't really worked out quite why. I know there are some large Brazilian firms like Huge Networks we'll see hanging off in the next slide. But one of the also interesting things coming out of this is that there's quite a strong Russian connectivity generally. And this is pre the kind of Ukraine invasion in February 2022. But in 2025, it's still very much there. And I think that's quite an interesting takeaway from this is that although it's shrunk, you can see that the kind of the shoot coming off is smaller, it's still very present. Also interesting is that the Switzerland or the Swiss and French networks are more tightly integrated. So we can see the kind of European community networks of networks are coming closer together, but still this Russian connectivity is a key theme. When we look at where and with whom the UK connectivity is happening, it makes sense that UK networks are going to be peering with Russian networks in the UK because that's where the UK networks are based. So this statistic is slightly skewed towards that. But we could also see that 406 UK networks peering with a Russian peer still in 2025, which is an interesting theme that I hadn't expected to come out of this data. When it comes to who they're connecting with, iNetCom, a large Russian network service provider. VimpelCom, they were sold off by Veon to a Russian oligarch back when the Ukraine war started in 2022. Also very high in terms of connectivity to UK networks. Mobile Telesystems, MTS, they might be better known as another huge Russian internet service provider. Selectel, they have data centers within Russia, and there are 6 data centers, so I'd classify them mostly as a data center operator, still very present. Rascom, they have a large fiber backbone that also runs across Europe, so maybe that's the reason people are peering with them. Also interesting thing to note out of this, KIAE are an academic network, also very, very heavily paired with UK networks. And then Evelecom are like a telecommunications company more generally, so another interesting theme coming out of this. But also what we can see is that we're pairing with those Russian networks not just in the UK, but UK-based networks are also pairing with them across the rest of Europe. And also some are happening in New York as well. If we look at this in more detail from the kind of Russian perspective, this is the Russian internet with their kind of first degree of international peers. You can see that this kind of domestic connectivity within Russia is quite prominent. A lot of this is down to the fact that back in 2019, they passed what could be nicknamed as the sovereign internet law, where the Russian government or the Russian ministry is able to order networks to shut themselves off from the rest of the world. You might have seen this tested. It happened in July 2023, again in February 2024 with a little bit more success than it did in July 23, and then partially in one region they managed to shut it off in December 2024 as well. It's also notable that like some of this also comes about because the Russian regulator has to be provided with the network diagrams of operators working in Russia and has the ability to install a technical means for countering threats, as they call it, where the Russian regulator is able to remotely change who different Russian operators are peering with without the operator being able to intervene within that. Nonetheless, still a lot of international connectivity, which I found very surprising. In terms of who they're peering with, most prominently, the largest country where these networks are based is Germany, followed by the UK, followed by the Netherlands, followed by France, followed by Japan, notably 4 of which are in the coalition of the willing that you might have heard bandied around a few times. So it's a really interesting kind of dichotomy between the 2 aspects there. And then in terms of where it's happening, if you take away the kind of the UK only part, a lot of it's happening in the Netherlands and Germany, where a lot of these networks are appearing. So I think this is a really interesting kind of discovery within this data. I really want to know why it's happening, because it wouldn't match what I would say my political expectation would have been coming into this, but still a really interesting thing coming out of it. But notably, it's not just these countries that are doing that peering. So if we look at the Ukrainian network and the Russian network, we can see that there's quite a bit going on there as well. There are 4 main Ukrainian providers that are also doing this peering with kind of the same networks that we are in the UK, which are listed on the right-hand side. So that RASCOM again, iNetCom, MTS, or Mobile Telesystems, all 3 of which were in the kind of the main UK peers list. If we look at this in kind of conjunction with other countries, there are 2 very clear countries that stand out from this graph as being the kind of like one being the most dominant connectivity between the 2 countries, which are the United Kingdom. You can see that there's quite a lot of connectivity both with Ukraine and Russia in this graph coming out on the left-hand side. But also somewhere like Poland, which is almost exclusively peered within with the Ukrainian operators and not with the Russian operators. So evidently there's the kind of the dynamic there coming out. To stay on the kind of theme of conflicts, we've now looked at Russia and Ukraine. Let's look next at Palestine. In this graph, we can see the kind of exclusively Palestinian internet. This is coming from 2022 when the data quality was a little bit better. But here you can still see that the kind of 2 main networks there. One of them is Mada al-Arab and the other one being Paltel, both of which are headquartered in the West Bank and still are kind of the dominant operators within the Palestinian region. I think the big takeaway from this is that kind of the dependency within these networks is very much on these 2 operators, including the ones that are competing with them. They rely on them for upstream connectivity. And if I put this within the context of the connectivity from Palestine to international operators, you'll see that a lot of this connectivity, which is happening largely at the Palestinian Internet Exchange, is relying on upstream connectivity from Israeli providers. And the largest one of these is Bezek International, which is just outside the kind of West Bank region. Even before the recent events that happened in Palestine, there were quite a lot of raids happening on the Paltel, the largest operator at the time within the Gaza region. And so the kind of political influence here is quite clear, not just within the network diagram, but also outside of that. And having spoken to a couple of Palestinian refugees not that long ago, they were talking about the fact that a lot of this was happening long before the recent events when it comes to kind of the Israeli exertion of control within the kind of Palestinian internet. Some of this comes back from the Oslo Accords, where things like the 2G spectrum is one of the few licensed spectrums within the Gaza region, and in the West Bank they get the benefit of 3G, but they're not allowed to use any additional of the elements of the spectrum without approval of the Israeli authorities, who never gave it. So that's kind of the geopolitical part. I've given you a bit of a whistle-stop tour coming through there. The last part I want to mention very briefly is the commercial aspect as well, and we can see this shaping the topology throughout. James Bensley this week shared his kind of discussion of the role of the tier 1, or what defines a tier 1. what I want to talk about more is the bit below that. So if we assume that some of the largest networks count as the tier ones, what happens to the network beneath? And this next graph, we see the kind of connectivity of different networks depending on the network size. So going across the bottom axis is how many networks a network peers with. And on the vertical axis is the average degree of the number of peers of the networks they peer with. So for instance, if you have a larger network moving towards the right, the bottom axis, how many, or taking the average number of peers of each one of those neighbors in the vertical axis. And you can see there's this interesting curve where it peaks quite early on and then it kind of drops off. And this is relatively stable across years. At the very end of these graphs, you can see that there's a little bit of variation. That's because the number of those networks changes quite substantially over time, depending on different peering behaviors. But generally, the trend is the same. And in this, we see that almost 30% of ASs peer directly with what we would have considered traditionally to be a tier one network. But also, as you move across the bottom, the number of peers increases, the size of the networks they're peering with are clearly getting smaller. So there's a lot of kind of direct, large to small network peering going on, which is an interesting trend that wasn't the case 10 years ago. One of the other interesting takeaways from this as well is this is looking at across the bottom, the size of the network in terms of the number of networks it peers with, and on the vertical axis, the number of eyeballs using those networks. We can see that they're quite close to the axes in both ones. They're kind of tracking the axes, suggesting that largely eyeball networks are not peering with that many people, and the networks that are peering with many people aren't really serving any eyeballs directly, which is a distinction that wouldn't be expected with companies like BT that for a long time were dominant in the UK market and also did quite a lot of carrier transactions across the region. Finally, when it comes to who's collecting to those eyeball networks, it's really interesting. This is kind of summarizing from the UK network when it comes to the number of eyeballs served versus the people that are peering with those eyeball networks. And the top networks here are largely carriers and CDNs rather than what I would have expected, which would have been some of the larger UK network connectivity providers. So some of the larger networks connecting again directly to the kind of eyeball providers rather than using what I would have considered a traditional tier 2 network that might have sat beneath that. So as a quick summary, I think what I hope I've shown you is that the geography and politics have quite a lot of bearing when it comes to kind of working out who's connecting to who within the internet and defining the shape of the topology, and that even small policy changes are having a material change on that topology. Whether or not I can attribute the UK's Online Safety Act as having much of an impact in the UK yet, given it's just come into force, is difficult to tell, but still there's an interesting change going on. Hopefully, I've given you some sort of food for thought when it comes to the role of the tier 2 network and the larger networks connecting directly to the smaller ones and not necessarily having the middleman in place. And also, there critically are data gaps when it comes to the African region and some of Central Asia when it comes to getting the BGP data. So if anyone can help us with that, and that might mean peering with a root collector in some way or offering to make some data available, that'd be really helpful, because at the moment we have very little visibility to be able to see what's going on, and it'd be very helpful, probably both to yourselves and to the kind of academic community, to be able to see more of that. I've been Josh Levett. I'm from the University of York, and if you have any questions, I would welcome them.
Ivan Beveridge from Almax. More a kind of consideration point than a question.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, you've got a lot of data and trying to make sense of it, and an amount of things like, for example, between Ukraine and Russia, the kind of connectivity. I would guess perhaps that some of that might be a kind of having the connectivity in place might be a hangover, certainly from people working in Russia and having a job in Ukraine and vice versa, that kind of thing, sort of generally. And so where you might think, for example, well, I would have thought they would be sort of definitely not connecting. There are potentially historical, even commercial reasons for that to kind of still be there. And similarly, with regards to where there doesn't seem to be some connectivity that you think there might be, may just be from availability of connectivity options. But very interesting talk. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point of thought. What is something that's come out of the Ukrainian Ministry of Telecommunications at one point was a block list of like Russian networks you must not peer with, which doesn't seem to have been particularly strictly followed. Which maybe that's one of the aspects, but it's one of those things that I would have expected the government regulation to have had quite a large effect in intervening there. So yeah. And then when it comes to like countries like Iran, at one point Pakistan set up fixed line connectivity with them, but it was never switched on because of sanctions. So like there's still that kind of political influence going on, even if yeah, there are some cases where maybe it is a kind of a hangover effect.
I've got a microphone. Narana Nipuna from LINX. Super interesting presentation. Thank you. And very pretty graphs, which is always a bonus. And it's more of a comment than a question. So the geography is one part, the political is another, but it would be interesting to also look at the topology or the network infrastructure, because so if you look at some of the graphs or some of the maps that you were showing, it looked like some of those countries were very well peered, while in fact it just means in some continents, like in Latin America, it just means that they're not peering or interconnecting with neighboring countries, but they're in fact going up to the US to get that content. And same goes for Africa. And it's simply because there's not that infrastructure there, right? There's not terrestrial fiber. So that would be really interesting to look at, but also the other way around, that how geopolitics affects the development of infrastructure. So we know that there are a few recent submarine cable developments that might not necessarily be put there for commercial reasons, but more geopolitical ones. So yeah, just a comment. It would be really interesting to dig deeper into that.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I would like to be able to get more takeaways, particularly from the kind of South America. The west of South America has very little data feed, and the same with a lot of Africa. And so we have the problem of like we could do some sort of analysis, but the data we have is so little. Possibly because there isn't the infrastructure, but also because there's very little in the way of interest in collecting it, that we can't make the kind of detailed things or detailed analysis that we would want to be able to provide something that was accurate and revealing. So we'd happily work with anyone on being able to do that, but at the moment it's difficult to do it because we know that the data we have is terrible.
Yeah, I'm happy to put you in contact with other people I know do research in this area there. So.
Hi, Simon Lockhart. Your slide about sort of Russia and UK networks peering and things, did you look at whether that's through intent or just sort of naturally ending up with things like the route reflectors at IXs like LINX? So it's not that a UK network has chosen to peer with a Russian network, but actually the Russian networks are on the route reflectors, the UK networks are on the route reflectors, and therefore it looks like they've chosen to peer with each other.
It's difficult because I don't have insight into all of the networks to work out what is like. I can't see where the traffic is going, so I don't know that any traffic is necessarily following these paths. When it comes to working out who's peering via the kind of route reflected paths, it looks from the validation that I've done to be relatively accurate in what I'm inferring, but sometimes a little bit of additional connectivity is kind of incorrectly inferred. But I would say that the level of that is quite small from what I've been able to see, but it would be interesting to be able to find out. And I would, if you have the data to be able to show what traffic's flowing where, that'd be really helpful to see.
It's hard to sort of look at traffic flows because certainly from LINX's perspective, that's not data that we can share. But you can get a list of who's on the route reflectors to see, well, are they well peered just because they happen to be on the route reflector?
And I think there are 7 Russian associated networks on the LINX route reflector.
Still on the subject of Russian connection, which you said several times that you were surprised at the level of interconnection particularly in the UK and Germany. I think it's a little less surprising when you consider how the financial and trade sanctions are actually applied, because while as a matter of politics and news, they're described as being broadly based tightening of the squeeze on the Russian economy and all that kind of thing. When you actually have to apply them, they are not directed at Russia. They are directed at selected Russian individuals and entities, including state entities. Yeah. So as a result, there is no legal reason why a UK or German network should not peer with a very large number or proportion of Russian networks because they're simply not the subject of those sanctions now under UK law or under European law. And on top of that, the European law has a general blanket exception. I'm not going to go into the details of how that applies, but there is a general blanket exception which even networks that were otherwise sanctioned might be able to qualify for, that would make it lawful to peer with them. And in the UK, although we don't have that blanket exception, there are individual exceptions that are granted, again, to support the continued communications. So when you apply that to it, the kind of decision-making that would be needed to make it surprising to see that level of interconnection would be individual companies taking an overtly political decision in an environment that is driven generally by technology and commerce rather than politics. The levers of policy are not being exerted to prevent that.
Yeah, I think that's quite clearly the case. And I think it's a really fascinating part of it that like I had expected it to be more restrictive, but actually you're right, it really isn't. And so it shows quite clearly in the data, I think, and that's my big takeaway from it.
Last question here.
I'm just wondering how much use you make of latency to find out the truth tellers, as it were, because speaking from personal experience, I did some work in Oman, and I was actually asked, I was expecting to hear a layer 2 circuit going via the Gulf of Aqaba, which was the only official route at the time. I don't know whether there's been additional ones. And of course, I was told I could have much better latency if we used Western-bound connections, which we all knew where the Western-bound connections went through. And I was intimated that there were also level 3 services. I don't know whether they involve NAT or something like that. I don't know. But there's also apparently a large fiber link that goes for Iran, for example. So you could see people who are connecting to India, for example, who are not going via the Red Sea, for example. Have you done any research on that basis to see you can find out who's actually telling the truth about who they're actually sending their data via, as opposed to just who they're peering with?
Not really. I think the where traffic flows is a very difficult problem, and yet latency gives you some of that. But ultimately, when it comes to trying to work out who's connected through traceroute, if the latency between one hop and another is unreasonably long, that we're just ignoring it because it sounds like they're probably not revealing infrastructure between it. But I guess the similar thing can be applied to work out where traffic might be flowing. But then they might send, I don't know, TCP, ICMP traffic in different directions and game it in other ways. So it's one way of looking at it, but it's a difficult one because people have commercial incentives not to reveal that kind of information.
Oh, well, fair enough, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.